Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Molly Birch, and we have a special edition of the TV6 Digital Desk live stream today. We have an in-depth interview with NMU instructional technologist Scott Smith and middle school computer science teacher and blogger Letitia Barr. I spoke with the pair over Zoom about the use of AI technologies in the classroom, including how students can use them responsibly and how parents and teachers can encourage students to do so. Let's take a look at that full interview.
Well, thank you both for joining me today. I really appreciate you both taking the time to speak with me. We'll just get started with my first question is, how are students using AI in the classroom? What exactly does that look like right now?
Sure, it's okay. Go ahead, Scott.
No, I was going to say you can go ahead.
Sure. Well, as a former middle school teacher, I taught computer science and engineering at a local middle school in Montgomery County, Maryland. Students were using AI as really a homework help tool. I'm also a mom of a college sophomore and a high school senior, and my kids turn to AI when they need clarification. So there are a lot of great homework tools out there that they can use. So educational apps like Brainly, my own daughter, who's the sophomore in college, she said, "Oh, I'm familiar with Brainly. Like that has helped me clarify questions that I've had and things that haven't made sense to me, and help deepen my understanding." So free apps that use AI can be great homework helpers for kids because they're available 24/7 and when they need their questions answered on the spot.
And Scott, how are you seeing students use it?
I guess when I first got this question, I was assuming that you were curious about generative AI. A lot like Letitia was talking about, there are AI. I mean, we've been using AI for a long time, right? Grammarly's AI. And there are specific AIs that are domain specific that have to do with like homework help and things like this that are great. As far as, are we throwing generative AI in with this?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, for sure.
Okay. All right. So, as far as how students are using it, obviously, it's very, very good at creating content, right? So creating essays and things like this. And obviously that can cause some issues if for instance, that content is the main way that we assess students' learning. So the way students are using it quite a bit for essay writing and things like this. But they can also use it for a lot of different things like brainstorming, coming up with templates, first drafts, paraphrasing, all sorts of things like that. So there's a lot of ways that students use it. Some of it is very responsible, and some of it could be considered not responsible. And we can talk more about that.
Right, exactly. That segues perfectly into my next question, is that idea of responsibility. What does that look like, especially in terms of the generative AI? I'll start with you, Scott. How do we define that in a classroom setting, that responsibility?
Well, responsible use is going to have a lot to do with what the learning outcomes are and what the instructor's policy is for the course. So I'm speaking strictly from a university setting, so I can't speak to K through 12, but I assume it's relatively similar. So basically, the instructor might have totally legitimate reasons to allow a very broad use of AI in the course, depending upon the learning outcomes, but it's totally up to the instructor. So what's responsible use of it is going to have a lot to do with the instructor's academic dishonesty policy. So one instructor, for instance, at Northern, it's kind of wide open. I mean, instructors can use it how they see fit. So you have some instructors who do not want it used at all. So the responsible thing for responsible use in that context is not to use it. And then there's a whole continuum between that and use it as much as you want, just cite that you have used it and how you've used it. So I would say from my position, and Letitia might have a different view, but from the university position at NMU, it's totally up to the instructor as far as what the responsible use of it is.
I think responsible use is really key. We always educate our kids about the fact that you're not supposed to copy directly from a source and turn that in as your own work. Kids know that that's an example of plagiarism, and plagiarism is not okay. There are definite academic consequences in K to 12, just like there is in higher ed, when it comes to plagiarizing work. So if you're using generative AI and copying what is being generated, that's never okay in a K to 12 setting. I would say generative AI, if you're using it to deepen your understanding or to simplify the content of what you're being asked or to expand answers, then that's okay. If it's something that can be used to help deepen your understanding and wrap your head around something that maybe isn't making sense, then that's okay. You're not necessarily generating something that you're going to take and copy. I would say in any academic setting, that's not okay. And kids are always educated that from a very young age. So, I think about a tool like Brainly. It can be used to simplify or expand answers using the AI tutor. And what that does is it helps to provide personalized content based on the student's understanding of a topic. So it's using what they already know and clarifying things to help deepen that understanding. And that's very different from using generative AI and copying it and turning it in as your own work.
For certain. It should be noted too that generative AI can do some of those things as well. It's just kind of very tempting then if you're in that platform to go ahead and have it start generating things for you rather than explain things to you and paraphrase and things like that.
Right. So, and you talk about the instructor having that responsibility to define the use of AI in the classroom. Does the instructor also, is there a way that they can encourage that responsible AI use for those who do decide to allow to use it in the classroom? And I'll open this one up to both of you again, whoever would like to start.
Go ahead.
Scott, I'll let you start.
Okay. So, so we have, there's two different ways to look at this as far as use within a classroom. There's designing in and designing out. And designing, when we normally think, a lot of instructors think of, designing out. So how can I make it so that my assessments and my assignments and things like this are more AI resistant to AI use? But there's also designing in too. How can I use this responsibly to help my students achieve their learning outcomes better, right? So depending upon what the instructor wants the learning outcome to be, it would be, how the students would be able to use it. So like I mentioned before, there's things like some instructors at Northern have their students make a first draft and then have ChatGPT or a platform like it assess it and give feedback on it, things like this. You can also have it. You can upload your rubric to ChatGPT or Claude and have your first draft of your paper assessed against that rubric. It's actually good at that type of thing. So there's a lot of ways that it depends on the context. I would say it's all context driven as far as like what is responsible. I mean, we can do general things like, of course, you don't blatantly plagiarize something, but at the same time, there's so many things it can do and so many contexts in which it can be used. I can't give a monolithic, this is how it can be responsibly used in the classroom. Does that make sense?
Yes, it absolutely does.
It does. And I think one thing that, you're saying is that, and I agree with, is students today are digital natives and they need to have a good foundation and skill set on how to best use the information they receive from AI for better student outcomes and for when they enter the workforce, because AI is going to be part of their world regardless. So they really need to be equipped with the do's and don'ts of AI. They have to understand how to best use AI for education in a safe and accurate way that will yield the results they're looking for, but that are academically appropriate.
I think you really hit on something, Letitia, with what you were saying. At Northern, we recognize that, and we're trying to create AI literacy programs for students, faculty, and staff, like different programs, because they're different demographics, and there are things that are common, obviously common applications that would be broadly used across all three demographics. But at the same time, the type of demographic specific information that an instructor would need is going to be somewhat different than what a student would need. They use it for different things. And then you have a staff member, like a general employee. It's a massive productivity booster. So there's a lot of different ways it can be used, even in like a business setting. That would be very, very useful for everybody. So you kind of have to, like I was saying, there's common applications for everybody, and then there's demographic specific things that we're trying to, and something that you had also brought up, which is really important, I think, Letitia, is the students are going to be using this after they get out, right? After they get out of school, they're going to be using this in their careers. And I think it's up to the education system to some degree to be able to let them, to familiarize them with how it can be used responsibly, what its strengths and weaknesses are, what it's not good at, so that they're not trying to do something with it and it starts hallucinating and giving them all this crazy stuff, and then they're throwing this out to their employer, whoever, or their instructor, and thinking that this is right. They have to know what it can do well, what it can't do well, and the dangers and the strengths and things like this with it. And I think
absolutely, like where to draw that line, right? Where it's
yeah,
most appropriate and where it's not. And we've been
yeah,
educating kids about the appropriate use of technology for years now. And AI is just another technology tool where kids need to understand at all ages when it's appropriate and when it's not.
yeah.
Absolutely. Great points. And with parents, how can we include them in that equation? And I think, Letitia, this would be more directed towards you, but when it comes to dealing with homework at home, how can parents help their students, use those tools in a responsible way?
Sure. Well, homework can be, a very hot topic in many houses. I remember having my dad try to help me with math when I was a kid and the number of struggles we got into. So there are technology tools that can eliminate that battle in your house. Not that you want to just turn it over to technology, but sometimes you need that third party, right? That can kind of act as the buffer. So as a mom of teens, I would say the first thing is to remain calm when approaching homework with your kids. Take a deep breath. And I always come from a place like, well, tell me what you know, right? And where are we going? What do we need to try to do with the task at hand? So let them lead. Don't just come with your knowledge, because the way kids are being taught these days is very different from how we learned. So let your kids lead. And remain calm. Those are my first two tips. I would also say a third point is don't always try to correct your kids' work. They need to learn from their mistakes so they improve. So that's true at any age, whether they're a kindergartner or a high schooler or even a college student. Kids need to make those mistakes so they can learn from them. Also, don't cram the night before a test. That's, what, as a parent, you can say it till you're blue in the face, but if you keep saying it, hopefully your kids will listen. So keep reminding them to study as they go and, refresh and review, but don't try to cram in all that knowledge before. And that's certainly key for college students as well. And then finally, if you need a study buddy, it's okay to turn to AI. There are some really great educational apps out there like Brainly for both homework and study help. So like Scott and I have said, know when those tools are appropriate and use them appropriately in the work that you have to do.
Yeah, nicely said. Well, one thing I would say, and this is just kind of a gut reaction for me, is it could be difficult when it comes to generative AI, for instance, to know whether your students are using it appropriately or not. One of the things I would suggest for parents is get acquainted with it. Go on, openai.com, use ChatGPT, use Claude, use Bard, things like this. Become familiar with it, use it, know what it can do, know what it looks like, and maybe that'll help guide you just in general, as far as maybe seeing what your students are doing with it. But I think most people, especially older people, can be kind of afraid of this type of technology, or of technology in general, right? But this type of technology scares a lot of people, and they overly complicate it in a lot of ways. And I think just being familiar with it, I think that's just good in general, right? Because this isn't going away. This has becoming more and more ubiquitous. It's in it's in your email, for crying out loud. It's in your browsers, all your internet browsers. So this is something that everyone should become familiar with anyway. But with regard to um, instructors, with regard to your parents, whenever you're dealing, watching your students use any type of technology, you should probably become familiar with it.
And I think along those lines too, Scott, is, if you're a parent and you happen to be in your kid's room and you see a Chat GPT browser window open, don't just automatically assume that your child is using it to write their papers or to do their
Sure.
work for them. Be familiar with it, understand how it can be used as a study tool, and talk to your students about it and talk to your kids about it. Really say like, oh, I noticed this open. Can you tell me what you were doing and how you're using it to study? So have that
That's great.
conversation with them. Don't just jump to conclusions that it's being something that's being used for academic dishonesty purposes.
Absolutely.
Awesome. And my final question before we wrap up our conversation today is just, as educational professionals, how can we develop conversations both in and out of the classroom just about that responsible use of AI tools, and maybe just conversations about AI in general? How can we facilitate those conversations to maybe bring people to a place where we're not all as frightened as these tools as we are maybe today?
I think that's a great question. And I think, like Scott said, as parents, familiarize yourself with these technology tools. Technology comes at us really fast, but it's a lot less scary if we understand what it is and how it's part of our world. AI is part of everything. Like Scott said, it's in our email, it's in our browser. It's also how Spotify knows how to recommend songs to us. It's how Netflix knows how to recommend shows. So AI is part of a parent's world as much as it is part of your kids' world. Your kids might be using it in a different way, but I always say your kids like to be the experts. If you ask them about AI and ChatGPT and other tools like Brainly that they're using, they will be happy to tell you about what they are and how they're using them. So that's the first thing. Create a conversation with your kids about it. Don't be afraid to have that conversation. Opening that door and having that conversation shows your kids that you're interested and invested in what they're doing and that you care about them and their academics.
Yeah, perfect. Letitia brought up some good points. The honest conversation, if I was an instructor, the honest conversation I would have with people, I would ask people the class point blank condition of anonymity, right? How have you seen people using it? And some of that I've done that with some of my student workers and asked them, how have you used it, and with obviously condition of, in case they were, because to be honest, I want to know how they may have used it in academically dishonest ways as well, right? So we're living in a real world. People are using it, and I want to know how they're using it. And it also lets the other students in the class know how it can be used responsibly. Having the conversation about, like, for instance, one of the things I thought about was when I saw this question was, discuss the purpose of your classes and your coursework. Why are you doing this to begin with? Why do you need to learn something? Rather than, basically if you're using generative AI just to create essays for you, to basically get you grades, if that's why you're using it, what does that do? How does that benefit you? Do you want, for instance, would you like to see a doctor who pretended their way through school? Probably not. The engineer who built the bridge, probably not. You know what I mean? That's not a bridge you want to drive over. So, how would it affect, just in general, your brainstorming, how would it affect society if everyone just kind of pretended their way through things? So to give people more of an idea of, like, oh, it's not just about getting the grade and getting the job, it's about what you do with that, and how are you going to go through life if you kind of cheated your way through it. And I'm not saying that's what AI does all the time, but that's the way some people look at it, I should say. And what happens if we don't have access to it for whatever reason? The power goes out or the internet goes down. Like, are we just not going to be able to function now? So we need to, basically, the value of learning itself. Like, this is good to know. Like, you should know how to do addition and subtraction and multiplication without having to use a calculator. Why? Because you have calculators available to you all the time. but what happens when you don't? And knowing the principles behind things, even if you have automated tools that are coming up with the answers for you, you still have to know uh, the principles behind these things, if that makes sense.
Yes, it absolutely does.
Thank you for joining us for this in-depth interview, and you can catch us again live from the TV6 Digital Desk tonight at 8 Eastern Time. But for now, enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and thank you again for joining us for this interview.